On a frosty November night, the Kremlin shook with terrifying screams. A giant tsar, with a shaggy beard and eyes burning with bloody sparks, waved a carved iron staff furiously, like a beast in a trap. At his feet lay his 8-year-old heir, his skull crushed and his face withered with fear. His own firstborn son. This is not a scene from someone else's nightmare, but a real tragedy that took place in 1581. Ivan the Terrible, the first ruler of Russia to officially take the title of Tsar, from the Latin Caesar, stood there, confused by his own animalistic outburst, weeping over the body of his son Ivan. "I killed my child. I shed my own blood," he muttered through his sobs, embracing the lifeless body of the prince. The nobles, hiding in the shadows of the corridors, did not dare to approach. They all knew that in a fit of madness, the Tsar was capable of bringing death to anyone. This cruel paralysis of the mind was not a flash of madness in a void. It was the bloody climax of a life steeped in violence, growing paranoia, and calculated cruelty. Ivan had begun to strike fear into his neighbors long before this. In the vanished cities of Novgorod, in the smoking remains of his enemies subjugated in a frenzied dance of battle. Guided by the dogma that only cruelty and terror would keep Russia from falling apart, he created the Oprichnina in 1565, dividing the country and unleashing a wave of repression that ruined noble families. But the price of this powerful centralism was the death of thousands of innocent people, and, as it later turned out, the death of his own son. His bloody path began in the delivery room. On August 25, 1530, Grand Duke Vasily III and his second wife, Elena Glinskaya, had a long-awaited son. According to legend, the birth was extremely difficult. Elena screamed in agony, herbal decoctions were brewed in the tent, and Kremlin monks sang prayers incessantly, driving away the evil spirit that was preventing the heir from being born. From his very first breath, young Ivan's life was shrouded in fear and betrayal. Before he was 3 years old, Grand Prince Vasily died of a leg ulcer that developed into gangrene. The court physicians tried unsuccessfully to save the ruler, applying leeches and painful compresses to the wound, while little Ivan listened in horror to his father's moans and felt his parents' rotting flesh slowly giving way. On his deathbed, Vasily established the Boyar Duma to govern the country until his son came of age and appointed Elena as regent. But the very boyars who were called upon to preserve power in the interests of the young Tsar turned into a rat clan of intrigue. For 5 years, Elena Glinskaya desperately held back the conspiracies. She introduced a monetary reform in 1553, issued silver rubles, and fought against the appanage princes who were ready to divide Moscow. But her own mother could not withstand the pressure. In 1538, she was found dead in her chambers, her face contorted in a convulsion, her lips blackened by poison. It is believed that the boyar families, frightened by the regent's ambitions and her ties to the Lithuanian Glinsky clan, were behind this. For the orphan Ivan, a real hell began. The boyars, who had plunged the state into civil strife, divided into 2 groups that shouted at each other. The ancient Shwisky family, led by Prince Ivan Petrovich Shwisky, and the influential Belsky family, led by Prince Ivan Ivanovich Belsky. During the day, the boy watched as his blood defenders tore each other apart in the Duma, plundered the treasury, and searched under carpets for the jewels of the old Romanov family. Not yet royal, but already coveted. At night, he was left in a stone tent without food, sometimes pinned to the wall like a terrifying exhibit, and sometimes simply forgotten, and he fell asleep hungry, huddled against the cold floor. Years later, Ivan himself recalled in a letter to Prince Andrei Kurbsky, "My brother Yuri and I lived like beggars, without proper clothes or bread. while the boyars' servants and the boyars themselves, dressed in gilded robes and with silver bowls, enjoyed the riches stolen from our father's treasury. The neglect of the child was further exacerbated by double standards. In public, in the presence of foreign ambassadors and archbishops, he was dressed in heavy velvet clothes embroidered with precious pearls, and had to stand for hours on the stone floor, not daring to move. But as soon as the doors of the Kremlin chambers closed, the young Tsar was defenseless. For the slightest mistake, whether it was dropping a gold coin or a quiet sigh during prayer, he was beaten with a belt until he was blue. This inhuman contrast, honor and humiliation, instilled two fundamental fears in the soul of the future sovereign. Only absolute power can protect against cruelty, and any display of piety may conceal sinister treachery. This is how a vulnerable child, wounded by the betrayal of those close to him, grew up to become an autocrat whose history still frightens us with its dark side. Who would have thought that a gifted book lover and expert in theology in the heart of the Kremlin would grow up to be a ruthless tyrant? Young Ivan's education seemed impeccable. He absorbed the pages of theological treatises and quoted the Holy Scriptures almost verbatim. But instead of moral guidance, he received only fragmentary lessons and cruel examples of behavior from those around him. At the age of 12, he threw dogs and cats from the Kremlin walls with gruesome curiosity, watching their bodies smash against the stones, and soon moved on to experiments on larger animals, meticulously recording every sound of their agony. The young prince's first public outburst came at the beginning of his teenage years. In the grand Granovita chamber, where icons on the walls seemed to stare intently at the council, Ivan unceremoniously accused the boyars of treason. According to contemporaries, he had been silent during the negotiations, but suddenly jumped up from the throne, his face contorted with hatred. "You betrayed my father, you betrayed my mother, and now you are plotting my downfall, me, the anointed of God," he cried, pointing to Prince Andrei Shwisky. The guards were momentarily confused, but then dragged Shwisky into the courtyard. There, the prince was thrown into a moat, where specially starved dogs tore the unfortunate man to pieces. His pleas for mercy in the name of Christ did not move the Tsar, who was leisurely drinking mead from a golden cup on a high balcony. This brutal act was not a flash of anger, but a carefully planned message. The manipulations were over, Ivan would no longer allow himself to be played. Turning to the stunned boyars, he coldly pronounced, "The same will befall all who stand in the way of the will of God's anointed." In January 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan was crowned king in the Assumption Cathedral of the Kremlin. Contrary to custom, he took the crown from the hands of the Metropolitan and placed it on his own head, symbolizing that his power came directly from God, bypassing any intermediaries. Thus, he officially assumed the title of Tsar of all Russia, transforming Muscovy from a fiefdom into an ambitious empire. At first, his new position did not limit his activities to violence. Under the influence of his closest advisors, Archpriest Sylvester and Boyar Adashev, as well as his young wife Anastasia, whom he sincerely married in 1547, Ivan embarked on reforms. He convened the first, albeit timid but truly representative, Zemsky Duma, drafted the Sudebnik of 1550, which unified legal norms throughout the country for the first time, began reorganizing the military, and established orders for the management of every important state affair. Under his patronage, printed books appeared in Moscow for the first time, including The Apostle and the Book of Hours. Ivan was no stranger to spiritual life. He often held night liturgies, walked to distant monasteries to worship, and corresponded with leading clergymen. This duality, a pious reformer and a ruthless despot, persisted throughout his reign, and historians still argue about which image was the true one. The Tsar's family life was briefly idyllic. Anastasia bore him 6 children, and although only 2, Ivan and Fyodor, survived to adulthood, caring for his family gave the Tsar a sense of stability, if only for a short time. However, in 1553, a fire that broke out in the artisan quarter engulfed a significant part of Moscow. The wave of anger was directed at the relatives of the Tsar's deceased mother, the Glinskys. The crowd beat Yuri Glinsky to death right on the steps of the Assumption Cathedral, and panic and distrust of the boyars forever clouded the young Tsar's mind. Thus ended one of the few bright periods of Ivan the Terrible's reign, giving way to the coming terror and the Oprichnina. Imagine a Tsar whose tears and rage turned into flames and blood. How did early grief turn the ruler into the embodiment of terror? This event caused Ivan to undergo a deep spiritual crisis. He renounced secular life, convinced that the fire in Moscow was God's punishment for his sins. His final transformation into the Terrible was hastened by the death of his wife Anastasia in 1560. Tsar Ivan IV was firmly convinced that she had been poisoned by jealous boyars who were dissatisfied with her gentle influence on the sovereign. In a rage, he ordered his court physicians to be tortured until they confessed to the conspiracy. She was taken away by traitors. The Tsar cried out to his advisors, "My only angel in this world of demons." Modern historians tend to believe that Anastasia died a natural death, most likely from tuberculosis. But for Ivan, this only reinforced his paranoia. Enemies were lurking everywhere and had taken away his only love. When the Tsar finally emerged from mourning, eyewitnesses noted that his black eyes were constantly alert, as if searching for treachery in every gesture. This changed look heralded a new era, the era of the Oprichnina. In 1565, Tsar Ivan divided the Russian state into 2 parts: the Zemstvo, where traditional institutions continued to rule, and the Oprichnina, which was subordinate exclusively to him. The Oprichnina included the Moscow Principality and a number of neighboring lands. To protect his newly acquired domain, the Tsar created his own secret police force, the Oprichnina. These men, selected mainly from the lower classes, wore black clothes and rode black horses, and their harnesses were adorned with frightening symbols: a dog's head and a broom, signifying that they would be involved in ambushes of traitors and would cleanse the country of enemies. Often former serfs and ruined peasants, they were fueled by hatred for the boyars and loyalty to the autocratic Tsar. The fear that the Oprichnina sowed is difficult to overestimate. Thousands of people were tried without guilt, and the methods of interrogation and execution turned into a nightmare. Among the most cruel were stretching victims in carriages, harnessed in different directions until their bodies were torn apart, scalping while the prisoner remained conscious and watched as their skin was slowly torn off. Once the Tsar ordered a group of nobles to be brought to the Kremlin and forced them to watch the torture of their own wives and daughters. After one particularly inhumane execution of a boyar, Ivan dipped his finger in the warm blood of the victim and savored it, saying, "The blood of traitors is sweeter than honey." The terror culminated in the massacre in Novgorod in 1571. On a frosty January morning, the inhabitants of the ancient city awoke to the sound of drums. Black silhouettes of the Oprichniki appeared on the horizon, led by the Tsar himself. The pretext was a forged document. An informer claimed that Novgorod merchants had agreed with the Polish king, Sigismund Augustus, to hand over the city in exchange for trade privileges. Although the letter was soon recognized as a crude forgery, the Tsar had already given orders to cleanse Novgorod with fire and blood. For 6 weeks, Ivan and his Oprichniki told stories of unparalleled cruelty. According to monastic chronicles, up to 3,000 people were tortured and executed every day. They were crucified on trees, pierced with spears, and thrown into the icy waters of the Volkhov River. When the victims, bleeding to death, tried to climb out, the Oprichniki broke the ice with their axes. Entire families were locked in houses and set on fire, and those who ran out into the street were finished off with sabers. The clergy were treated with particular cruelty. Priests were beaten, forcibly given communion, and then punished with tongues of flame. The Hell of Novgorod became a symbol of the ruthless power that one man acquired when fear and loss of trust consumed his heart. The Tsar paid for his victory over proven or imagined treason with the blood of thousands of innocent people, and his black face was forever etched in Russian history as the image of the abyss into which power can fall when it loses its human boundaries. Imagine how the trading rows of Novgorod were replaced by ashes and blood. This is how freedom turned into the cruel wrath of Ivan the Terrible. In the mid-1570s, the people of Novgorod were proud of their ancient republic, rich merchant history, and ties with the Hanseatic League. But in 1570, Ivan IV launched the Oprichnina and decided to put an end to any hint of independence. His bodyguards, the Oprichniki, led by Malyuta Skuratov and Pyotr Basmanov, were ordered to terrorize the city. Those priests who dared to question the Tsar's divine authority over the church were burned alive on homemade grills in their vestments. Their church clothes burned along with their flesh. Archbishop Lawrence, who had rebuked the Tsar for his tyranny, was strangled, and his body was dragged through the streets like a sack of evil. Nuns were subjected to collective abuse in front of icons and then drowned in ditches. This was supposed to be a purification from sin. When the mass slaughter ended, less than 10,000 of the former 40,000 inhabitants of Novgorod remained alive. Trade, on which the city's prosperity was based, never regained its former strength, and the Moscow court finally established itself as the main center of Russia. The Tsar's personal life was no less chaotic. After the death of his first wife, the pious Anastasia Romanovna, he married 6 more times, and 3 of his wives died under mysterious circumstances. His third wife, Maria Dolgorukaya, was drowned the day after the wedding on the orders of the Tsar, who claimed to have discovered an unclean secret about her. One of the others, Vasilisa Milentieva, was reportedly buried alive when the Tsar learned that she had allegedly been looking at another man. By the end of the 1870s, his health and sanity had indeed become alarmingly frail. His once strong and muscular body swelled from intemperance in eating and uncontrolled passion. The Tsar was increasingly tormented by chronic pain, probably from syphilis, and symptoms of mercury poisoning, which he was treated for by court physicians. But the darkest episode unfolded in November 1581. On a damp day, the Tsar accidentally looked into the chambers of his son, Ivan Ivanovich, and found his daughter-in-law, Elena, in light, transparent clothing. "Insolent whore!" he roared, lunging at the pregnant beauty. She fell to her knees, trying to cover herself with her hands, but the Tsar paid no heed to her pleas or tears. He beat her so badly that crystal flew off the gleaming shelves with precious vessels. Her screams echoed throughout the Kremlin, and at that moment the 27-year-old heir burst into the room to protect his wife. "Father, for God's sake, stop! She is carrying your grandson," he begged, grabbing the Tsar's hands. Betrayal was reflected in the Tsar's eyes, and in a rage he grabbed a heavy scepter, the symbol of his power, decorated with silver and enamel, and with one blow knocked his son to the floor. Ivan the Terrible, seeing what he had done, threw down the scepter and fell upon the bleeding body. "What have I done? Have mercy on me, Lord," he trembled, embracing his dying son. The young prince was treated by court physicians for 3 days, but his wounds proved fatal. On the 4th day, the heir died in the arms of his murderous father. Ivan IV turned into a wandering shadow. On dark nights, he wandered through the corridors of the Kremlin in torn clothes, muttering, "I killed my son. I killed him." Dio. His hair and beard, which had been dark with gray streaks just yesterday, turned completely white in a matter of days. The Tsar stopped eating and sleeping, his mind sinking into insane visions, and his entourage did not dare even breathe near the man who had been struck by such terrible news. Thus, in anger and despair, the Rurik dynasty collapsed, and Ivan the Terrible's bloody trail remained forever in the history of Russia as a symbol of boundless tyranny and family tragedy. The whisper of his dead son tore through the silence of the palace corridors. Ivan was terrified by every rustling sound, convinced that the prince's ghost had returned for revenge. According to contemporary accounts, as soon as anyone stirred, the Tsar shuddered, as if his son's spirit was following close behind him. During the 2 dark years after the death of his heir, Ivan's madness took on increasingly sinister forms. Court officials recounted how, in the early hours of the morning, they found him wandering through the chambers, whispering the name of his dead son. Sometimes he would stand for hours at the prince's tomb in the Blagoveshchensk Cathedral of the Kremlin, shaking as if overcome by a freezing cold, refusing to eat or drink. During these days of deep sorrow, flashes of fierce cruelty alternated. The Tsar, later called the Terrible, seemed to want to atone for his guilt with the blood of others. He ordered the execution of the slightest offenses. A servant who broke a tray was sentenced to death. If someone barely touched a sacred pillar during liturgy, death. If an ambassador did not bow low enough, death without excuse. In one of his fits, he ordered the execution of all the doctors who had treated the prince, accusing them of deliberate incompetence. The only heir after these tragedies was his second son, Fyodor, born to Anastasia. According to contemporary accounts, he was always smiling and preferred spending his days preaching in monasteries rather than engaging in military and state affairs. Ivan's death undermined the more than 700-year-old dynasty of the Rurikids. On March 17, 1584, the Tsar suddenly died while playing Gedres with Boris Godunov, his favorite at court. Some historians remembered suspicions of poisoning, while others saw it as the result of years of stress and untreated illnesses. Whatever the reason, the death of the first Russian Tsar was as sudden as many of the executions he ordered. His swollen, emaciated body, the result of serious illness and gluttony, was dressed in a monk's robe. The Tsar wanted to leave this life as the monk Jonah, the name he had secretly taken, dreaming of one day becoming a monk. The image of Ivan the Terrible remains a grim lesson about how unresolved childhood pain and unlimited power can give rise not only to the greatest power, but also to the blackest abyss of the soul.